wasn't long after the tragedy of September 11th, 2001, there were conspiracy theorists just coming out of the woodwork convinced there was more to the incidents than met the eye. Well, in the years since that day, there's also been a community of experts that's been gathering what it considers to be proof that New York City's World Trade Center towers, and for that matter, another building, World Trade Center 7, that was not hit by jetliners, did not collapse as a result of those sinister acts. And a person who's kind of leading this campaign is Richard Gage, a Bay Area architect with the American Institute of Architects. And Richard is joining us in studio. Richard, thanks for coming in.
Thanks, Chris. Great to be here with you.
Let's talk a little bit about your evidence. That's the big question. What is your evidence? What separates you from the conspiratorial thinkers? What do you have?
Well, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth now comprises over 600 architects and engineers, all of whom are demanding a new investigation of the 3 World Trade Center high-rise collapses on 9/11. Most people don't even know about the 3rd worst structural failure in modern history. This is Building 7, a football field in length away from the Twin Towers, that came down at 5:20 in the afternoon in a perfect, symmetrical, free-fall collapse against 40,000 tons of structural steel that was designed to resist it, with a 3 to 5 safety factor. So when architects and engineers look at the collapse of this 3rd high-rise, they know that it is a controlled demolition. We were told 7 years later by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that it was due to fires. Well, architects know that you can't have 400 structural steel connections failing per second in a fire-induced gravitational collapse.
Now, you have evidence in the dust. Tell us about this.
This is quite problematic for the official story, which tells us that the Twin Towers came down, of course, by jet plane impacts, explosion, fire, structural weakening of the steel, and a gravitational collapse down to the bottom. The problem is that we have several tons of molten metal on video, photos, etc., underneath the Twin Towers as well as Building 7. Well, this turns out to be molten iron and not melted structural steel. Fires can only get to be about 1,400, 1,600 degrees. Steel doesn't even begin to melt until 2,700 degrees. So we have a huge problem in trying to explain all of this. Well, it turns out that it's molten iron, not steel, and it has the evidence, the chemical evidence of thermite, a high-tech incendiary used by the military to cut through steel like a hot knife through butter. Not only is there evidence of this thermite incendiary in the molten iron, but throughout the dust, as you mentioned, ubiquitous throughout lower Manhattan, billions of tiny iron-rich microspheres are found in all of the dust samples found by Dr. Stephen Jones, a physicist formerly from Brigham Young University, as well as R.J. Lee and the USGS. They have no explanation for this in the official story, but these tiny iron-rich spheres contain the chemical evidence also of thermite, including iron, aluminum, manganese, fluorine, etc. Extremely unusual elements that have no business being in an office fire.
So are you saying then that the planes by these al-Qaeda extremists did not have anything to do with the structural collapse? I mean, you know, the stories that we hear is from where they hit, that then all of that pressure, that weight, and that heat then basically imploded the buildings 1 and 2, the World Trade Towers.
That is the official story. But the problem is that these buildings collapsed at 2/3 of free fall speed. That means they are continually accelerating faster and faster, straight down through the path of what was greatest resistance, the 80,000 tons of structural steel in these buildings designed to resist any kind of a collapse. A building can't collapse at almost free fall speed and do any other work, like crush 80,000 tons of structural steel. It's got to slow down. It can't get faster and faster. In addition, Dr. Stephen Jones finds in the dust tiny chips, red chips of nanothermite particles. This stuff is extremely sophisticated. It's composed of particles that are 1,000 times smaller than the human hair, of iron oxide and aluminum powder and other unusual elements. This is now peer-reviewed in the Open Bentham Chemical Physics Journal, and it's a huge problem for the official story, taking scientific circles by storm.
So the question is, excuse me, Jennifer, how did this stuff get in there in the amounts it would have to be in the building to accomplish what you say it accomplished?
Right. Well, somebody would have to have access, obviously, through security in the World Trade Center system. So we certainly are asking for an investigation of the security company as well. The 700 architects at ae911truth.org are demanding an investigation well beyond the actual physical collapses. But if you had access to the hoistways, you could have access, therefore, to all of the core columns and beams in these structures, and without being noticed by the occupants. Especially if you had an elevator modernization going on as cover, which in fact we had going on the 9 months prior to 9/11. Ace Elevator had the contract, and their employees fled when the collapses, when the planes hit the buildings.
Okay, so this group of architects and engineers is growing seemingly by leaps and bounds. I mean, but who's listening? Who that needs to listen is listening to the argument.
Well, it's a grassroots movement growing by millions every year. Every city has a 9/11 truth movement that can be Googled in just about every city. It's pretty fascinating. But for large part, the mainstream media is not picking up this story. I applaud KGO Radio for picking it up. This is extremely important for us. We have architects, engineers that are listening. Virtually every architect and engineer I present this to ends up agreeing with us because the evidence speaks for itself. It's actually quite overwhelming, and they end up signing our petition.
Well, just one last thing before we go, because we've got to jump away to traffic and other elements, but have the fringe elements made it difficult for you to get this message taken seriously?
There are some fringe elements, I suppose, of every movement. No, we are not conspiracy theorists. We're technical building professionals looking at the forensic evidence found at the crime scene, and that's what we focus on, and we're being taken quite seriously. For instance, engineers and architects want to know why there's no floors found at the base of either twin tower. We had 110 floors, each an acre in size, and yet with 90,000 tons of concrete. That concrete is pulverized in midair to fine particles. And we only have a couple of stories of debris at the bottom, and it's not floors.
Okay, well, it seems like your strongest argument is World Trade Center 7, which was not hit by a plane, and as you point out, later in the afternoon came down as though it were a perfect planned demolition.
At free fall speed.
All right, Richard, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for your time, Richard.
Richard Gage, Bay Area architect with American Institute of Architects. 720.